Hi. Coming from a war zone myself, I felt myself connecting with that film colossally because, like the story of Anwar, like the story of the Afghans at the start, the more they bombed us, the more they killed us, the more unethical crimes they committed against us, the more it radicalized us, and the less interested we were in engaging in dialogue, as they were hoping for, the more interested we were in fighting back and defending Iraq and defending ourselves. And with that said, I'd like to thank you on behalf, because I read Blackwater and I read Dirty Water, I'd like to thank you for, spreading even a fraction of the truth as it is to so many people here. But what my question was is, I digress, yeah. My question was that now that we've all been here, now that we've all watched this, now we've all understand what you have shared with us, where do we go from here? What do we do? How do we address this on a daily basis? Because I'm unsure, because I'm just a student myself, so coming from me to you, how do we challenge this huge machine of multinationals and people who profit from what they're doing to us? How do we tackle that?
I'd also be interested in what you guys have said. You want an answer first, or do you want me to? Well, I'm not a politician, I'm going to answer your question, but I just want to preface this by saying that I don't think any idea I have would be any better than an idea that you have in answer to that question. If I thought that I had the solution to this, we would have put it in the film. And in fact, some people, when we were getting feedback from friends and colleagues, some people said, there should be a call to action at the end of this and a 5 points, what you can do about this. And I often feel like that's just sort of a cop-out from recognizing a reality that we're sort of at a ground zero moment. Large parts of the anti-war movement were co-opted or crushed with the ascent of President Obama. I think a lot of people are so tired of what seems to just be a permanent state of Western war, throughout the Muslim world. And I think that we have to ask ourselves the kinds of questions we were presenting at the end of the film, like how does a war like this ever end? Is not meant to just be a rhetorical device. I actually want to know, how does a war like that end, short of all of us returning to some form of activism? One of the greatest sources of hope that I actually see right now are hackers and information activists. They deal much more severe blows to governments and corporations than a lot of other organizing efforts. And I think that figuring out some way to merge together the, let's call it online activism, hacktivism, whatever, with old-fashioned being in the streets and putting pressure on these institutions. I also think that the state of journalism in the world today is in a totally morally bankrupt position. And corporations, of course, are in control of a lot of the methods of disseminating information. The surveillance state is intensifying. And I think it's very easy to get overwhelmed and want to take a razor blade, to yourself, given what we're facing. But I do think that we should be having a creative conversation about how to merge together online efforts targeting corporations and governments with actual physical being in the streets or serious organizing.
I second that. I think the key thing is us. The reality is that it's only through public pressure that things ever change. And the reality is there is no silver bullet. There's no magic solution to it. It's a long-term, lifetime commitment to activism. And the reality is, we all come from very different backgrounds. We have different opinions. We have to find ways to actually work collectively. Because the reality is that most of the time with these issues, we're atomized. We are individuals. We feel very small. And the people that we're facing are very big. But in fact, I think that many people around the world actually have the same concerns that we have. Even if there are differences, we have to find, like with the anti-war movement, ways of consolidating that, where there are key things that we say, no, this is wrong, we cannot accept that. One of the most important things is that at times of war and peace, when people use lethal action, those that go and kill people, and that's a very serious thing. And sometimes you have to do that, but there needs to be accountability for that, and there's absolutely none of that. And I think, the key people is actually people like you, because the reality is that, the reality of life is getting jobs and paying bills, all sorts of demands, but you're actually at a stage of your life, obviously it's never too late, But at your stage, you have that ability to not be so institutionalized that you start thinking in what is the practical way to act, what is a reasonable thing to do. So that's the two things I'd say, is that it's really key for us to act. Talk to your politicians, find other people like you. If you hear or speak to friends, family who have certain sort of standard views about, justifying killing terrorists or whatever, challenge that. And also, I think, really key is engaging with people who have a very different opinion to you. That we combine with people who are like-minded, but that we don't just speak to people who are thinking like us, that we need to be talking to those who have, wherever it's reasonably possible, who have a very different view. And it's a long-term struggle. There will be victories, but it's a long-term battle, and expect to be doing it for a lifetime. That's the key thing.
Uplifting message to give to a bunch of students. You'll be doing this for the rest of your life, complaining about. I mean, sometimes I'm like Jeremy. I want to take a razor blade to my wrists. It can be quite depressing. Sometimes, you know what? Sometimes you have positive days. You look around and you think, and obviously I use the word positive in a relative sense, but you look around and you think, well, we didn't go to war in Syria in August. We are probably not going to war with Iran anytime in the next 6 months to a year at least. So you look around and you think, actually, that has been achieved by people in this room, by public opinion, by maybe a war weariness, as Jeremy puts it. So I wouldn't underestimate what the power of social change in grassroots movements and activism and all these things together, and the odd occasional decent mainstream politician can do collectively. I wouldn't sell ourselves short. But it is an uphill struggle. It is probably a lifetime struggle. I think the key message I would say in answer to your question is, you have to educate yourself. So it's something so patronising and cliched in the university room. But on issues like this, in specifically, knowledge is power. What is investigative journalism? It's about finding out things they don't want you to know and spreading it to people who didn't know. And you look at something like drones. I mean, people talk about drones, but how many people actually understand what goes on in the field? Most of us have been out to Pakistan, seen the actual consequences. Jeremy documents it in his film. But even without going there, there's basic facts and figures. When I'm on TV or on radio debating a subject like drones, and I say to the presenter or to the other panellists that, did you know that drones in Pakistan will blow up their quote-unquote target and then wait for rescuers to arrive and fire another missile, a la Hamas bombing buses in Israel in the mid-1990s, the famous double-tap strike? People who are educated, senior, experienced, well-read journalists, commentators, politicians have no clue. So I think it's very, very important that we have the facts at our own fingertips to expose what's going on, because let's be honest, a lot of people out there, a lot of ordinary people out there are not kind of brainwashed by corporations. They're simply unaware of what's going on in their name. And I think that's what's so important when we come together for meetings like this, when we watch films like this, when we read books and articles, that is what you have to remind yourselves of, that it's the information. And that's why I am kind of semi-optimistic that we live in an age where it's much harder to keep a lid on some of this information, and that is thanks to partly to people like Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden and others, and it's also thanks to people like Jeremy Scahill.
Hello. I just wondered, what do you see as the continuities between the war on terror and the earlier war against black liberation movements within America? Thinking specifically of how prisons like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay grow out of the domestic supermax system, and ADX Florence and Pelican Bay, and programs like COINTELPRO as well. And whether as activists we should do more to join the dots between that earlier period. I mean, my specific interest in this is because my brother was one of the people extradited last year and detained without trial, and it was Robert King of the Angola Free who helped us the most, more than a lot of British Muslims.
thank you for that question. I'll answer in reverse. Yes, absolutely. And this is something that we talk about in the US all the time. For the most part, people who are organizing around the issue of private prisons, the death penalty, political prisoners, police brutality, these supermax style prisons that they have where people are cut off from any communication with the outside world are people of color. And the anti-war movement in the U.S. is an overwhelmingly white entity, and I think that is a very, very serious problem because they are utterly connected, as you imply. There were these series of cases in Chicago in the 1970s where a unit run by a guy named John Burge, who was a Vietnam veteran, and he was then a police detective. They were actually using tactics that they had picked up from the war in Vietnam to torture young black men and torture them into confessing to crimes they didn't commit. and this was a massive, massive scandal, and it was a systematic torture system that is deeply connected to what we saw then in Guantanamo and in Abu Ghraib and elsewhere. There's the same dehumanization of people that takes place, but also the same corporations are providing personnel as advisors to structure these programs. The other thing we're seeing right now in the United States is that a lot of people that are coming back from the wars as soldiers are becoming police officers. And the US military is donating its military equipment to municipalities. And so there's a paramilitarization of law enforcement in the US. You mentioned the COINTELPRO program of the FBI, which is the counterintelligence program, where you had not just the FBI, but also police forces around the country infiltrating radical organizations or anti-war organizations or the Black Panthers and others in an effort to try to destroy them from within. That clearly is what the U.S. is doing throughout the Muslim world right now with its counterintelligence operations. It's also happening domestically inside the United States where anti-war groups and others are being spied on. So making those connections, I think, is very essential. It's a very, very key part of justice organizing right now.
Thank you. Two points. The first one, when you say we've killed more civilians than terrorists, who exactly are the terrorists? Given that in this context, from what I can see, it's the Americans that have gone into countries, invaded, destroyed the infrastructure, killing indiscriminately. So who exactly gets the label of terrorist, given that these are people who are reacting to to attacks and to acts of terror, in fact? So, I mean, we might not like the Taliban regime, but I don't like the Obama administration, but if I go and bomb Americans, then I'd be labelled a terrorist. So the exact nature of the labelling of terrorists, I'm unsure about. The other point is, you mentioned engaging with people you disagree with, and I even sort of saw you nodding. And this has overshadowed my enjoyment of the film, because obviously I've come here knowing that you objected to sharing a platform with Mother Agnes, who gave us another narrative on the war on Syria. So how can you reconcile that?
As to your first question about the label of terrorist, I mean, first of all, I'm not saying that the Taliban is a terrorist movement. I think that much of the fighting that's happening in Afghanistan